Welcome to this, our last Lenten study for 2024. We've been looking at children in the Bible, and the first week we looked at the children of the matriarchs and patriarchs, who have the comparison of being in the Muslim tradition as well. Then we looked at girls that were interesting and boys who had power. Last week we looked at Jesus and the various stories we have about his birth. So this week we're wrapping it up with looking at the children in the Christian scriptures themselves, in what's commonly known as the New Testament. Right away you're going to notice something very, very different. First of all, they don't have names. Not a single one of them has a name. The only one who even can come close to having a name is Herodias' daughter. And we get that from Josephus, who was a Jewish historian that was contemporaneous with the writing of the New Testament, not from the Bible itself. None of these children have names, and none of them are actually the center of their own story. They're all there to either propel the story of the grown-ups who are part of them, or they're there for Jesus to teach a lesson to either his followers or to the crowd around. But they do not have agency. They are just there. Now, one of the things that when we're talking about the history of the scriptures, right off the hop, it's important to know that the scriptures were written over about 1,000-year period tops, maybe even only 800. And the traditional assumption is that scriptures are 5,000 years old. And that's not to say that they're not, but that means that there's a whole lot of oral tradition before you actually get to the written tradition. The writing of the Hebrew scriptures, that happened over a few hundred years. Assyrian to Babylonian exile and then forward. It didn't happen before that. Before that, there may have been bits and pieces that were written down, but they were not brought together. In fact, none of it was brought together until the Babylonian exile. And then the Christian scriptures, we have them going on from maybe 50 of the Common Era to maybe 120 of the Common Era, but even 120 is kind of late. Most scholars will put that at around 100, and 100 is where we get the letters of John, the book of Revelation, and the Gospel of John, all three written by very different people. In fact, all five could have been written by different people. But that's how much scripture we have. Now, when we're talking about the Christian scriptures, one of the things that lends itself to more authentic historical people than the Hebrew scriptures is that we do not have elaborate stories. I found this out years ago when I was doing people of the Bible with a group of Sunday school kids, and we had all of these fabulous characters throughout the Hebrew scriptures. I mean, we could do Sarah and David and Jonah, and everybody was so exciting, and they had a huge story. Then we get to the New Testament, and no one has a story. Jesus has a ministry. Certain people, like Priscilla, pop up a lot. There's 6 Marys. There's a lot of names, but there's not much story. That actually, as a historian, that means that they're probably more authentically real people. The fact that they're more recent in time also lends itself to that they were actually real people rather than conglomerations that created a character like perhaps Abraham and Moses and David and who else? We don't know. So as a historian, we have that kind of a litmus test. When we get into the Christian scriptures, the fact that all the children are nameless does not make them insignificant. The easiest way to block out someone feeling kind of a relationship between a character is giving them a name and giving them personal characteristics so that some of us can relate to them and some of them can't. If you have a character, and check this with any type of literature, if you have a character with no name, no description, no background, then whoever's reading it can place their own assumptions onto the character and you can feel more connected. Now, whether or not that was part of the desires of the original writers of the Christian scriptures, I don't know. They were a different time, a different sensibility, different goals. But if they're not the goal, which could be, the lucky happenstance is that any child reading any of these stories can relate, especially if you're doing ministry with sick children, because almost every child in the Bible, and really they're only in the Gospels, because Paul's letters really don't have any, Acts doesn't have any, Revelations doesn't have any. It's all the Gospels. They're almost all sick, and they're almost all have other people advocating for Jesus to heal them in some regard. That's an incredible pastoral opportunity to work with children. So I certainly encourage you to kind of keep that in mind when we're going through. Anyway, we're looking at primarily 4 stories. As I said, most of them are sick, not exclusively, but most of them. They do not have identities. They do not have characteristics. We know very little about any of them, but they're there. One of the things about reading the Bible that has been a challenge over the last number of decades is that a lot of people see the Bible as the story about men, by men, for men. That's a very narrow understanding of it. And feminist theologians kind of fall on 2 different categories in that regard. I'm definitely not assuming that women are excluded. In a patriarchal culture where patriarchal stories are the norm, the fact that we have so many women and children who are identified means that the early church recognized a level of inclusivity that we just do not respect enough in our modern era. They might not have done things the way we do, but, quite frankly, we don't do the things the way they do. We just have to respect the lives that they lived and how they went about doing it and how they lived their faith to the best of their ability. So the first one we're going to look at is the daughter of Herodias. As I mentioned, Josephus, who is a historian roughly, 2739 to 100 of the Common Era, he was recognized as the first Jewish historian. Now, again, the word Jewish, that's put back on him. Jewish as a term didn't exist at that point in time, but he's recognized as telling the story from the Judean perspective, from the Hebrew perspective. And he talks about Herodias having a daughter named Salome. Now, that's the only reference we have. We have nothing biblical to identify her. Josephus and other records do not tell us that Herodias had any other child, daughter or otherwise. So it's assumed that Salome is who we're talking about. But if we're going strictly by the biblical narrative, we've got no way to know that. So we have the story of Herodias, who wants to get rid of John the Baptist, because John the Baptist had been incredibly critical of how she was living her married life, how she had divorced someone so she could marry someone else in the family. And there's all sorts of incest lines, and it's all kind of gross. But Herodias and Herod Antipas considered it legal and legitimate, and while Antipas might have been scared of John the Baptist, Herodias wasn't. She wanted him gone. So the opportunity arises when Herod Antipas has a birthday celebration. As the king, he's the one that throws his own celebration. No one throws it for him. And we get a glimpse at what the court might have looked like. And then we see the story of Herodias' daughter from a previous marriage coming out and dancing for Herod Antipas. Now, dancing was a major part of the Hebrew tradition, and it was often done by women. We even have Miriam as one of the first people in the Bible, in the entire library, to mention the fact that she's dancing in celebration after they have managed to get their people out of Egypt. So here we have Herodias' daughter dancing. Now, chances are it was spontaneous. A lot of the dancing was just pure celebratory. Some of it was scripted and expected, but you would not expect the stepdaughter of the king to be employed to be the entertainment. So chances are it was not planned. She just was feeling so good about the moment, and this is something that she could give as a birthday present to her stepfather. So she dances, and we read that Herod Antipas is so impressed, so wonderfully overjoyed by this gift of this dance, that he tells this young girl, "Whatever you want, I'll do." Now, we saw kind of with Jephthah's daughter a few weeks ago that promises made without any kind of context usually don't end up well. And that's what happens to John the Baptist, because Herodias, according to the story, finds this as a fantastic opportunity to get rid of her number one nemesis, which is John the Baptist. So Herod, having made this promise, the girl comes back, says, "This is what I want, not that what my mother wants, but what I want." So you got an interesting relationship there, obviously, between mother and daughter. So the king sadly just does what he promised he was going to do, and bye-bye John the Baptist. And not only that, they bring his head on this plate, give it to the girl, and then she takes it to her mother Herodias. So, I mean, squeam factor much? Daughters didn't seem to mind at all. And again, Josephus actually mentions the death of John the Baptist. I haven't read Josephus in a very long time, so I can't speak to how he mentions it, but it is acknowledged. Herodias, by the way, is the only woman, and potentially, if her daughter is Salome, is the only woman in the Christian scriptures that is a verifiable historic figure outside. As I mentioned, Josephus mentions her. She's part of the Herodian Empire. Now, the Herodian Empire was basically in league with the Roman government, and he was not considered actual legitimate Hebrew people. Most of the Hebrew people at the time looked at the Hasmoneans as the genuine ruling family. And there was tension between the Herodians and the Hasmoneans, kind of like Montagues and Capulets, or there's a family out of the southern states that people talk about too. I can't remember their names. But there was these family battles, and there was marriages back and forth to try to legitimize the Herods, but the Herods were partially insane, and it didn't work well. So we have this highly, highly intensely political family begging for legitimacy in a nation that really doesn't think they're legitimate. Anyway, eventually, Herodias and her husband, which I'm not sure if it's Antipas or not at the end, is exiled, and they're sent to Gaul in 39 CE is the last history has any mention of either of them. We don't know if she died then, but that's when we put her last date at, because there's nothing else. But as I said, she was a legitimate historical figure even outside of biblical sources. So after we've got Herodias' daughter, the next one we're looking at is Jairus' daughter. Now, as a little girl, I loved the story of Jairus' daughter. It took me years and years to realize the story really wasn't about the daughter. It was about her father and her father's faith. But we have the story in, again, the three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Mark is always considered the oldest version, and Matthew and Luke are either versions of, or they might have information that differs a little bit, but Mark is always the original, usually the briefest, though not exclusively. So we have the story of, in all three of the synoptics, of this synagogue leader. He would probably be the arch-synagogus, which basically means the overarching leader, and that's a role that either men or women could fulfill in that day and age. All that meant, I mean, we have a modern sensibility to the word synagogue, that it is a building of worship, kind of like a Muslim mosque or a Christian church. But that wasn't how it was used in the first century during Jesus' era. We don't even hear the word synagogue before the repatriation after the Babylonian exile. So it probably was something created while the priestly class were in exile in Babylon. And the building was basically a glorified town hall. It was where you possibly went to practice your reading. It was where you had town meetings. It was where you saw arts presentations or dramas. It was where you went if you needed a lawyer. It was where you sent your older boys when it was time for them to learn more than they could at home. So it wasn't really a place of worship, although there might have been a time when prayers were held there as well. But it wasn't the primary place. This is still a tradition that is based on the temple. Until the diaspora after 1970 CE, after 70 CE, nothing, the center of worship is not a synagogue. That happens when rabbinic Judaism takes over centuries later. So this is the synagogue. So it's basically a town official is who Jairus is. And he comes to Jesus and says, please help my daughter. Now, in Matthew, the daughter's dead. In Mark, the daughter is a little girl. In Luke, she's 12. So we all have these different details about how the story goes, but they're all essentially the same. Jairus goes to Jesus and said, please come help my daughter. In the way, we have this intervening story of the woman with the hemorrhage. Again, that story has different details as well, but the whole point is that it's ratcheting up the tension and the stress. Jairus wants to get back to his kid, wants Jesus to come back too, but we have this woman in this crowd getting in the way. By the time Jesus finally gets back with Jairus to his house, the professional mourners are there. Now, that's actually a job description in that time in history. Other cultures had that experience too, and I think there might be some cultures in the Middle East that still have professional mourners. So people who come and they demonstrate the grief loudly with music and somber prayers for the family. It's not something we have the experience of in North America, but it was something that would have been very, very common in Jesus' era. So these people, these professional mourners, meet Jairus at the door and say, look, she's dead. Just don't bother wasting your time. And Jairus is so dedicated, and they start laughing at him. And depending on which gospel you look at, either Jesus goes in, or Jesus and his closest friends go in, or Jesus and his closest friends and the parents go in. But he reaches out to the little girl and says, get up. She awakens. She's alive. And then he admonishes the parents to take care of her. It is Jairus' faith. Now, one of the really interesting things on that is the woman who is hemorrhaging is told her faith has made her well. Jairus isn't told that his faith has made his daughter well. Not every healing had that messaging. A lot of them did, but not all of them. So from there, we go to the Syrophoenician woman. Now, this story is only in Mark and Matthew. In Matthew, it's the Canaanite woman. So it's the same story. Syrophoenician is Syria and Tyre. It's a Gentile territory, either way. And we have this woman coming to Jesus when he's on vacation, trying to relax with his friends, asking him to heal her daughter, who is very sick. Some versions have that she's got a demon, which is kind of a generic, I don't know what's wrong with her, but something's really bad. Others, she's just ill. And then we get Jesus saying saying no, and then her challenging him. Now, I love preaching on this story because two of the myths we always have about Jesus is first that he was sinless. You can't have that discussion without identifying sin. Now, if you identify sin as separation from God, then absolutely Jesus was not full of sin. He was sinless because he was always connected with God. He's God incarnate. If you define sin as behavior, then we've got another conversation going on. Not one we're going to have here, but it's a conversation nonetheless. So we have that myth that we have to work through. Our second myth is that Jesus is all-knowing all the time. And the church has held on to this for a very, very long time. I'm not a fan of that. I actually think that the whole idea of Jesus being fully human is to allow Jesus to be fully human. Humans make mistakes. And the story of the Syrophoenician or Canaanite woman and her sick daughter is a perfect example of Jesus making a mistake. He was showing off for his buddies. He kind of gave her a flippant response. I don't come for you, I come for the house of Israel. She does not take that as a response. She pushes back and says that even the dogs eat the crumbs under the table. Jesus has to walk it back. He has to change his view. The assumption that so many writers have gotten into over the centuries is that Jesus was just testing her because he knew ultimately what was going on, but this was a test. Well, that does not hold up to the scripture itself at all. What we have, though, is a woman who pushes Jesus, who challenges him. The only other one who genuinely challenges Jesus, and I'm talking about the trial at the end of each gospel, but the only one who really challenges Jesus outside of that is his mother Mary at the Feast of Cana in the story from John, where he says, I'm not ready yet, it's not my time. And she says, yeah, it is. Only two people in the entirety of the four Gospels that genuinely push back. And again, not the rabbis and the Pharisees, the scribes. They're scripted to kind of trip Jesus up. That's very different than pushing back on him when he does not think, when he said something wrong. We have two women who did it. The Syrophoenician woman is one of those. So this incredible story of Jesus saying, okay, you know what? You're right. I will heal your child, if you heal your daughter. And he does. Again, the story is not about this child. The story is about the relationship, the conversation between Jesus and her mother. From there, the next character we're going to look at is a little boy. In fact, he's got one whole verse dedicated to him in the Gospel of John. One, that's it. It's the feeding of the 5,000 and the sharing of the loaves and fishes. The miracle itself is in all four Gospels, but it's only the Gospel of John that says where those loaves and fishes came from. This boy stepped up, and he has become the poster child of generosity and thoughtfulness and kindness. In fact, if you're a child looking for stories from the Gospels, Jairus' daughter and the boy with the fish are the two stories you're going to go for, because they're beautiful stories about children interacting with Jesus. Most of the people Jesus heals, he doesn't touch. These two he did. He took the loaves and fishes from this child. Now, a lot of ink has been spilled, some of it even by my pen, about what was really the miracle of the feeding of the multitudes. Of course, the traditional reading of this is that miracle was the multiplying of the food. A more modern reading is that the miracle was the generosity of the people around, that this boy was probably not the only one who had food. Once they saw that he or others were giving their food, more people came forth, and it was so much extra food that they could fill baskets afterwards. So is the miracle the multiplying of food, or the miracle the multiplying of attitude? Open question. You can land wherever you want with that one. But it's worth talking about that here we have an example of people hoarding, keeping their own bit to themselves, and it's only when they see that other people are loosening up that they choose to loosen up themselves. That is actually probably more profound telling of the story than if Jesus had just been doing this kind of magic-ish act on his own. So theologically, I think that everybody who's sharing is probably more accurate. It certainly goes better with the lessons that Jesus wanted to teach. So these are four primary stories of children in the Gospels. Now again, no names, no identifying. The only identifying factor we have, in fact, is Herodias' daughter. She danced. That's all we know. The boy with the loaves and fishes was kind. The other daughters were dying or dead. Now there's three more stories, and you'll notice that there's relatively a balance between the stories about boys and the stories about girls. Three other healings that happen one very much like the Syrophoenician woman's son, is the court official outside of Capernaum who wants Jesus to heal his son, and Jesus kind of pawns him off. There's no discussion then like there is with the Syrophoenician woman, but eventually Jesus does heal him. And then we have the story of the woman's son, her only son, dying. He's already on the litter. He's being carried towards the place of his burial. And Jesus stops. Mother's distraught, obviously, and for good reason. Two reasons, actually, in that culture. One, a mother loses her child. There's absolutely nothing worse for a mother than to lose her child. But in that patriarchal culture, to lose a son, especially the only son, he was her guarantee of being able to live in a relatively independent way. She would have to become a beggar or ingratiate herself on some other family member, because in that society, sons took care of their mothers. Daughters didn't, because the daughters were part of their husband's household, taking care of those mothers. So when we look at, for instance, Peter taking care of his mother-in-law, something happened there, that his mother-in-law was in the house where he was, not just his mother. So that's the double whammy when a mother loses her only son. Jesus would have known that. He would have been part of that. So again, kind of like Jairus' daughter, he reaches out his hand, he touches this boy and says, "Get up." And then he tells them to take care of the boy. Now, interestingly, neither in the story of Jairus' daughter or this raising of the son, where Jesus touches someone who has died, is there any mention of Jesus being ritually unclean or having to go through the ritual of cleanliness, which I think is kind of interesting, because that's a real thing in that culture. It's not even mentioned, not even hinted at. And then the final one we have is the story of, let me see, I'm looking at my notes here. Oh, yes. The father, again, kind of like the Syrophoenician woman, where his son is epilepsy. Now, it says epilepsy in Matthew. In Mark and Luke, it says he's got a demon. Again, the demon's kind of like a red herring. What is wrong, we do not know. and he asked Jesus to get rid of this demon. Now, this child is also brought to Jesus. He's not dead. He's just full of whatever this is that is causing his illness. And in Mark, which on one of the rare times when we get more out of Mark than we do out of Luke and Matthew, we have this child who has been like this his entire life. This demon, this whatever's in him, has even put him in situations where he's almost gotten the child killed. So this father is desperate, saying, "Please cure my child," and Jesus does. But what's really interesting about this particular story is the father goes to Jesus after he has already gone to all Jesus' closest followers, the ones Jesus intends to hand this ministry to after his death. And the disciples can't do anything for him. So Jesus turns to the disciples midway through this story and basically says, "What's wrong with you? You are too stubborn and denying faith so much that you can't even heal this kid? So of course I can do it, but you have to be able to do it too." So we get a wonderful opportunity where Jesus is so frustrated with his closest followers who, again, don't get it, don't understand their roles, don't understand that they're supposed to be the ones taking up this ministry after he's gone, and they do not have the ability. Now, we know after Pentecost, and as they move forward, we have some stories in the book of Acts where they actually do get the healing thing right, the disciples do, but not yet in the Gospels. So this is really an interesting version of the healing story, where Jesus actually chastises his closest followers for not living up to expectations, and that the man understood the followers were supposed to be just as good as the master, and they weren't. So not being satisfied with that, he goes to find Jesus directly. So that's the kind of overall or overarching look at children in the Christian scriptures. The only other places that they're mentioned is Ephesus and Colossians. There is a discourse towards the end of both of these letters. Now, these letters are ascribed to Paul, but most scholars agree that they're not convinced that Paul wrote these letters. We have this understanding of plagiarism in our time period. It didn't exist when Jesus lived, when these letters were being written, when the Christian scriptures were being put together. It was common for a writer to credit their writing, their letter, their creation, their whatever, to someone who had very high esteem, as a way of homage, but also as a way of getting attention. So we have these letters to the Ephesians and the Colossians. And towards the end of both of these letters, we've got something that scholars refer to as the household code. So this is where we get the bits about wives, listen to your husbands, husbands, take care of your wives, slaves, listen to your masters, masters, take care of your slaves. So we have this section in there also of children, obey your parents, and parents, teach your children their faith and raise them well and do not treat them poorly. That and a bunch of healing are the only stories. And of course, the boy with the fish and the dancer that is at Herod's party are the only references to children in the Christian scriptures. It is not nearly as exciting, but they're far better stories for teaching what Jesus wants us to do and how he wants us to live and how we are to understand Jesus' healing as an act of wholeness, of returning someone to who and what they used to be. So that's the children in the entire library of the Bible. Now, these are the 66 books that the Protestants look at. Anglicans have additional ones, so do Catholics. Orthodox have additional books as well. There could be children in there, but they're not ones I'm familiar with. So these are in the Protestant version of the Bible. And although there's not many, they all have an incredibly important place in talking about the narrative of God's intervention in the world. So thank you very much for being part of this Lenten study. And as you continue with your own Lenten journey, keep in mind some of the lessons that these children have to teach us. Bye.